So, what I want to find out with this one is if the palm can tell us if someone is honest, a potential sexual predator, and whether or not someone is a decent person as well. Can the palm tell us these things? Yes, absolutely it can. Can I find a clear enough image online of a celebrity to provide me with specific details? Not really. So I'm going to have to go more on chirognomy, that is the shape of the hand and the fingers, with this one as with most of these Sunday case studies. But by the end of it, I think we'll have some sort of conclusion. So, I just want to say that I've always kind of liked Russel Brand. And I've not watched any of his stuff recently or even in the last few years, but I watched a lot of the Trues back when that was around sort of late thousands or whatever, late 2000s. And yeah, it was good stuff. So having heard all the stuff recently, I thought, well, it'd be interesting to see what his palm tells us. So here we go. So hopefully by the end of this video, we'll have something, some sort of conclusion as to what the palm is saying. So because I can't really get to the specifics in terms of the chirology and dermatoglyphics in the palm itself, and really uncover the kind of accuracy that I'd like to, or what I really wanted to find online was pictures of his hands in great detail, or a palm print. That would have been amazing. So we're going to have to go with the chirology and what that tells us. So I'm going to look at specifically honesty and dishonesty and any kind of sexual deviancy as well. So when we look at the general shape of the hand, we have here a fire hand. That's a long palm and short fingers, but he's only just a fire hand. He's a mixed hand really, because there's a lot of air going on there as well. So it's a kind of squarish rectangle. It's wider at the base, so it's a spatula palm, a wide base spatula palm, and that shows someone who is trying to change the rule book, is interested in finding new ways of doing things, reinventing things, and motivated. Only becomes motivated when they're inspired. Otherwise, they kind of don't do much. Hard to explain, but they're not happy unless they're changing the rules. They're a bit of a rule breaker. And other signs will show that in the palm as well, like the separated life and headline. I don't think we really see too much of that going on, but we'll look at that in a little bit. The fingers themselves are very splayed outwards, and that shows a very an outward searching ideas person, especially with the length of his fingers. They are overall only just short when compared with the length of the palm, and that's how we determine the length of fingers, whether someone has a long or short finger in palmistry. Is the longest finger, the Saturn finger, is it equal to 7/8 of the palm's length or more? It's sort of debatable. I've looked at this quite a few times now, and it's close, but I think it is only just on the short side. Saturn and Jupiter are high set. Mercury is always leaning away from the rest of the fingers on both hands in all images. So there are several things to uncover here. This is the left hand. Now on his right hand, we have a slightly different story. Now on his right hand, on every image I can find, Saturn, just at the tip, Saturn tends to lean a little bit towards Apollo at the first phalanx. And another thing to mention, and this is really important, Mercury at the base on the left hand, Mercury's third phalanx on the left hand is not as wide as Mercury's third phalanx on the right. That's important, and we'll get around to what that means exactly later. The third phalanx of Jupiter, and you might have seen me mention this in other videos, where we have, Russell doesn't really have a short Jupiter finger, although it is shorter than Apollo. There's a bit of a... Jupiter is kind of a little bit pointed, which shows the need, the desire to impart information learned. Russell is a teacher. He enjoys explaining things. He's never happier than when he's explaining things to others. And this, the length of Jupiter, it's not exactly short, but it's not as long as Apollo. You could interpret that in a couple of ways. We've got a mild inferiority complex. His reputation strongly matters, and he's vain, and he is a bit of a show-off, and that's what this length of Apollo shows us. And also as well with just how well developed it is in comparison, to the other fingers as well. It's quite wide. There are a lot of talents here. There's a lot of, and his success is dependent on that, and his career. And Saturn is the finger of career. Which is why the career line tends to curve towards the Saturn mount. Saturn is all things planning and necessary. It's the inevitable, so it's time, but it's also our conscience. It's the right and wrong. It's our moral conscience, and it's how we perceive ourselves. It's how we perceive ourselves in society, how we see ourselves fitting in society, and it's also how we see the world and our what's the word? It's our outlook. It's our demeanor. So it's how positive we kind of come across as well. So a short Saturn is someone who's very jovial and doesn't like the rules, is not a fan of bureaucracy. A long Saturn finger can be someone who's quite melancholic, someone who is, strictly abides by the rules. So when you've got someone with a short Saturn finger, it doesn't mean that necessarily they abhor bureaucracy. You have to look for other signs in the palm as well. For example, and I've mentioned it earlier, a life and a headline that aren't connected. So that's someone who's a bit more sort of radical thinking and potentially impulsive as well. And on that note, impulsive, that's kind of a key word with the theme of, as to exactly the reason why I'm doing this palm reading today. I don't see impulses here, and that's not a good example here. So the lifeline and the headline are joined for a good amount of time. And what I mean by that is that it's not so that this is an overly cautious person. I really wish I could get some more clarity in these images. But a person's headline that remains joined for this amount of time is someone who claimed their independence around the age of about 19, 20. It's kind of an average life headline independence claiming age. It shows us that this is not a person who acts impulsively, someone who is cautious, but not to the point where they miss opportunities, if that makes sense. They're not too slow moving through life. And the overall, well, I don't know what I'm doing there, the overall sort of shape of this person's palm tells us that he is a very sort of quick moving, quick thinking person. I mean, this is certainly someone who takes a lot of time to process information, but is constantly thinking. And although I've already stated this is a broad-based spatulate palm, you can see here, just look at the way the palm splays out at where the fingers meet. It does as the fingers do it. The fingers sort of follow on from what the palm wants to do, and that's, explore outwards to find out, to understand, this sort of reaching out. And a person with these kinds of gaps between the fingers, not so much between Apollo and Saturn, but this sort of splaying outwards of the fingers. If we didn't have such a square palm here, square palm is practicality and appreciation for rules, and we don't have a short Saturn finger here as well. We don't have a disconnect between the head and the lifeline. So we're actually looking at someone who does have appreciation for rules and understands that there needs to be some level of order and someone to make the decisions. And, this is someone that certainly understands the rules. And although I think Russel Brand's probably got this sort of reputation of being someone who promotes anarchy, actually, I think this person understands that even within anarchy, there needs to be some sort of order. However, that saying this, these outwards splaying fingers, it does sort of show that without some sort of limitations in place, this person potentially could run amok. And I think that that's, reined in a little bit by this overall kind of, as I've said, is a sort of a squarish rectangle. Without this, if we had too much going on over here, which I did actually, I would expect to see with someone who's quite clearly and obviously, a show-off, perhaps even a bit of a narcissist, which I think is freely admitted. You could expect to see over-imagination, this over-indulgence in the way they appear to others, and this over attention seeking is what I'm getting at. We're not seeing so much of that here, and also with a large lunar mount and a headline that droops quite low down into it. I mean, yes, his headline does droop quite low down into it. It shows a couple of things. Firstly, lunar is imagination. It's a place of escape, travel, restlessness, dreams, and fantasy as well. So when we have a headline that droops quite low down like this, it shows a tendency to at times look at things unrealistically, and also become a tendency towards depression as well, unrealistic ideas and dark thoughts. But the fact that we have actually a very reasonable and a practical, if amount of lunar, this is not someone, if we had this sort of drooping headline here like this, with, an overdeveloped lunar, that's something to be a bit more worried about. That's someone who has the potential to carry out these unrealistic ideas that they're having. Because although, at times he might feel depressed or delve into, have these kind of unrealistic or deep and dark thoughts, there's not over imagination. There isn't, this isn't happening too much. So if we had both of these signs together, that would be a bit more worrying. The heart line here, and I've seen it in another image, it does stretch right out onto Jupiter. It's relatively straight, a heart line that reaches up towards Saturn with a sharp curve, shows us someone who is aroused by visual stimuli and is quite satisfied sexually by the very sort of basic and obvious sexual stimuli, whereas someone with a straighter heartline has a much more complex psychological need in terms of affection. This person's love language is probably far more deeper than that, but also a heartline that reaches up over onto Jupiter. Jupiter is this place of and I've said this many times, ambition and honor and ego and authority and judgment. So with a heartline that reaches over here, this is someone that knows and understands what the right thing to do is, I suppose. And Bob Geldof has got a very similar heartline to this. And also, check out just how low set the thumb is. A low set thumb, it shows us someone who is, it's meant to be a bit of a sign of someone who's a bit of a humanitarian, a bit of an animal lover, and also it's a sign of a book lover as well, someone that's keen to soak up information. And as I've already said, that the fingers already show us this. And if we look here, actually, this is quite a good example of, this is a clearer example of the just how level these Jupiter and Apollo is. This is the left hand. On the right hand, Jupiter is a little bit shorter, and this shows us that that's very mild, but there is some sort of inferiority complex that's settled in, and this is compensated for by, we can see it's the basal phalanx of Jupiter is ever so slightly wider. It kind of gets wider as it reaches the bottom, and you see it a bit more on the right hand. So here we are, here's an example. And, it's not huge. And actually, just looking here, this is not a perfect example because you can actually see that it appears that Jupiter is actually longer than Apollo in this image, but that's just the angle. You can see how Jupiter, it does widen ever so slightly at the basal phalanx there. It's not massive, but there is some compensation here for a very mild inferiority complex, and this compensation generally it's with, some people throw themselves into work. Most of the time it's through alcohol, drugs, or sex. And so on that note, let's have a look at the finger which best represents our sexual desires and expression, and that's the Mercury finger. Not in this image because it's just a rubbish image for that. So the little finger is the finger of expression, communication. It's also how we show ourselves off, reveal ourselves off to the outside world. It shows us how we communicate our message, what sort of expression we more sort of tend to lean towards in terms of how we express ourselves. So some of us express ourselves through the physical end results of the work we do. So if a carpenter, for example, they require to leave their mark on the world with tangible results. Other people are writers, singers. There's all sorts of ways that we express and communicate our message to the world. And someone who is strong in their voice, and I wish I could see the more specifics of the palmar surface. I'd be looking at dermatoglyphics and really looking at things in a specific way, and I'd be looking for this little S-bend on the bottom of the lunar mount there in the skin ridges, which shows us someone who uses their voice to communicate and express themselves. But the little finger shows us, we're physical creatures, and sex is a big part of how we express ourselves and communicate physically. And the little fingers can show us a great deal of information about how well developed we are in terms of our psychological framework, in terms of our sexuality and how healthy that is or isn't. And the little finger here on the left hand, it shows us sort of who we are inwardly in terms of our expression and communication. And I suppose what I'm looking for is any crookedness, anything twisted, anything deviating, because literally those words and how the finger represents what it shows us, if we were to see any of those things in the little finger, then we could also see exactly what those words represent. We don't see any sort of deviance here. We don't see a twisting. We don't see leaning drastically at the tip. And even if we did, if you see a gentle kind of leaning of the mercury, I mean gentle, it's subjective really, but you get to know after a while, after looking at so many palms, what's healthy and what isn't in terms of that mercury lean. And there are other things as well in the palm that can kind of suggest what's going on there and what that means. Sometimes a gentle kind of leaning of the mercury's tip shows us leans towards physical appreciation and art, appreciation of artistic beauty and all things beautiful and natural. And so that kind of shows us that this person with a leaning sort of Mercury appreciates physical beauty. And as I've said, the heart line's quite straight, and we don't see that sort of gentle leaning. It's also indicative of someone who has high diplomacy skills as well. But as I say, we don't see that. This is, all things considered, actually a very straight Mercury finger, and I don't see them all that straight. And I see a slight sort of kink on the inside here, and that's certainly someone with the need for sort of sexual engagement. But there's nothing unhealthy here. It doesn't look as though we're looking at a twisted or warped or sort of deviant sexual kind of makeup, if that makes sense. Psychologically speaking, I think this person's quite healthy in that regard. With regard to the rest of the fingers, you can see how Jupiter leans towards Saturn, and as I've said, Saturn is this conscience, is our moral compass. It's the sense of duty and right and wrong, and how what's the right thing to do. Jupiter is decision making. It's judgment. It's authority. It's a place of honor, and it's leaning towards this as a very sort of. It's a good picture actually, because it shows us the natural kind of finger leanings, which is exactly what we want to see. Jupiter is relying on Saturn for judgment, so you can see that this person relies on the sense of what's right and wrong in terms of how to make decisions. Doesn't necessarily mean that right and wrong is, doesn't necessarily mean that they have a good sense of right and wrong. It's just that that's their decision making, certainly dependent on their moral compass. Their moral compass, Saturn finger, again, it looks quite straight. There's quite a large knot there at the second join, which is slightly sort of contradictory because it provides some sort of sensibility and caution and seriousness, and that's not really who we know Russel Brand to be, at least in the limelight, or at least how he portrays himself, and that's not entirely who he is, and I say that because he's got a bit of a double headline, and we'll get around to what that means. Saturn does tend to lean slightly towards Apollo, so his career certainly dependent on his abilities to on his talents, on his abilities, just full stop, and his ability to engage with others and work with others, and his ability to sort of to shine. So Apollo is this finger of all things. It's the sunshine in our life, but it's also our ability to shine. It's what makes us bright, and it's what makes us happy. So all in all, I can't help but to think this is actually quite a well-developed person. The other hand, as I say, Saturn at the tip tends to lean on the right hand towards Apollo. And again, obviously this is dependent on the right hand, shows us how we're affected externally, practically, physically. So this person is hugely dependent, their career is hugely dependent on their talents. But also it can be, and it's not sharp, it's not a severe sort of bend at the tip there, but it can be a sign that mixed messages were provided as a child. I don't see Mercury being low set in the palm, too low set in the palm, and that would be some sort of indicator of poor kind of development, psychological development as a child, which could provide us with some sort of idea as to the psychological makeup. And I don't see that here. It is slightly lower, and I do think that his father was a little bit absent, but I don't think there's any major underlying psychological issue there that could contribute towards any sort of deviancy. Now then, honesty. If we're talking about looking for signs of, again, more signs of honesty in the palm, there is one thing I would always look for, and that is the loyalty line. It's the deep cleft that develops from the thumb, works its way in and points towards the lifeline. It's a sort of horizontal ridge there in the palm, and it shows us a person's devotion to their career, to their life at home as well, their family, their children, their wife. And more than that, it shows us when this person has been mistreated, or those they care about have been mistreated. They are fully prepared to fight for truth. You don't see this on people's palms who are dishonest. And, that's not to say that this person doesn't have the capability to persuade others or the capability to lie. I mean, that is, everyone has the capacity to do that. But this person certainly has the ability to persuade, and, this high ability to, there is an exceptional ability there to persuade others with just being such a good, strong, an expressive communicator. However, Jupiter, it's just so well formed. It does kind of indicate, and really here you can see Saturn is held upright by Jupiter and Apollo, which is interesting. Saturn really does appear, that's not straight, is it? I can't do this. I'm not even sure that why I'm doing this doesn't help at all. Saturn does appear to be straight and well developed. It's not short. I'm not seeing the signs here of a dishonest person. So on that note, let's look for dishonesty. So pathological liars have Mercury and Apollo fingers sort of twisted inwards. And as I say, we don't see that here. Liars are also said to have rosettes in at the palm's base, so the lines there at the bottom of the palm, I looked at my own hand then, at the bottom of the palm that kind of separate the wrist from the palm. Some people have two, some people have three. If one of the rosettes is broken, this is a sign of a liar. I can't see in these images with any real clarity as to whether or not this is in his hands. The flexible fingers, the reason why the fingers, when they're sort of bent or twisted, show us what that means and how that means. It shows us that their own truth is flexible, that their philosophy is flexible, that the way they perceive life and the rules that they believe, that they abide by, are also flexible. So when you have someone with straight fingers, well developed, what I mean by that is, it's not any thin or fat in any one sort of place too much. They're generally just sort of straight and true. So too is their philosophy or their truth. I mean, they're not completely straight. Saturn does, it could be the angle, it's not particularly helpful image. In any case, there's nothing worrying about the straightness of the fingers there. Another sign of disloyalty, or the potential for being disloyal, and you can't take any one of these signs alone as gospel really, because sometimes there are some other factors that can come into it, like arthritis, for example. You can't say, well, someone's got twisted fingers, so therefore they're a liar. If you're not looking at all the facts, you're never going to draw an accurate conclusion. So one of the signs of disloyalty is a short headline. But again, that on its own is not clear enough It's not a clear enough distinction by any means, or even evidence. And in all the images, well, that was terrible. In all the images, I can see Russell does have a relatively straight headline, with the exception of this image here. But that could just be the kind of the shadowing effects in all of the images. See what I mean? They're just awful clarity. They look relatively straight, and as to how long they are, it's hard to say. Looks like that stops beneath Apollo, but I believe the headline doubles, and this shows us someone who is capable of thinking in a completely different way for a different to suit a different circumstance, a different environment. And you often see this with famous people. They put on a persona, put on an act to in order to kind of get by and deal with the vast attention and the media. So it's a sort of coping strategy. Really often you see it, but also it shows that someone who has quite a high kind of mental sort of capacity and an ability to problem solve as well. You often see it in intelligent people. But it does also show, if we're seeing this has a person who has the ability to put on an act, well, what does that really say about honesty? I don't know. I don't know if that's really relevant. So the heart line is also another indicator for honesty. If we were to see a short heart line stopping underneath Saturn, then we could be sure, well, not sure even, but it's one indicator. Any one of these signs alone, you can't sort of come towards an accurate conclusion. I mean, when I've said about sort of twisted or gnarled fingers, you can't say, okay, well, that person's particularly, sort of twisted or crooked by nature in some way, because they could have arthritis. So you've got to look at everything and look carefully. I mean, a short heart line is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does show that there is a lack of commitment, particularly in professions. So if someone with a short heart line, they're not completely sort of committed to the role, and you can be sure that they're going to find something wrong with that role and move on to something newer, somewhere else where they can move on and get more out of a newer situation again. So someone with a headline, and I think I've already mentioned this, it's long reaching, it's right up onto Jupiter. It does show someone who is committed to a cause and is quite sort of justice driven, highly idealistic, perhaps a little bit unrealistically. And I think that it shows actually a little bit of self-discipline. And on that note of discipline as well, the squareness at the edge of the Venus mount of the palm provides a little bit of discipline. The conic fingers, however, the kind of rounded fingers, not so much with Jupiter, you can see it there, it is a bit pointed. That the conic roundedness does, however, show us the opposite, and that's a little bit of impulsiveness. So you've got the two that are kind of negating each other, I suppose. And you can see it again here, look, that little bit of sort of squaring off there at Venus. It's a good sign, really, if we were to see utterly roundedness. Let's have a look at an earlier picture. I mean, even in this creepy image from about 10 years ago, you've still got that square, you've still got that innate sort of inherent ability to be self-disciplined. So I suppose some of the things I would look for in this person's palm, if I actually had clarity, would be the rossettes here and whether or not I'd see any sort of breakages. Also a girdle of Venus as well, if we see a semi-formed one, if there's any breaks there, or if it's sort of ragged like this, that's something I would look for. That would show us a great deal about their kind of psychological, sexual sort of makeup, and just how healthy they are in that respect. I'd look for an intuition line or a sympathy line that reaches up and touches the girdle of Venus as well. and this would show us how someone is, let's say, unhealthily persuading others in some sort of, sexual way as well. But as I say, we don't see a short Saturn finger. I was expecting to see a shorter Saturn finger because of what I thought I knew about this person, and that was they're very sort of anti-establishment. But actually, it seems like this person does understand the importance of the rules and has a strong moral compass. I'm not seeing a lot of what we're hearing, if that makes sense. Has this little study proven that Russel Brand is innocent of the things he's being accused of at the moment? Not particularly. But I think it does show us that inherently we've not got a dishonest person, not got a bad person, and I don't see a sexual deviant of any sort. So, it does show us that, potentially that, sure, it's possible that he's guilty of the things that he's being accused of 10 years ago or so, but I don't think that he is the person he was back then. And even in the older pictures, even in the older images, I'm still not seeing any evidence as to what the hands can show us about a person. And, in terms of dishonesty and any sort of signs of a sexual predator in the palm. So, this is a horrible picture, isn't it? So, let me know your thoughts. What do you think? Yeah, like I say, this is a potentially contentious subject, isn't it? And a lot of palmistry is subjective. And I'm very aware that, I suppose, my own preconception may well muddy the waters here, but I have tried to be as impartial as possible. Yeah, maybe that is impossible to be impartial as well. Which is why I like the readings where I'm just sent a picture of a palm and told nothing at all. A date of birth is handy, or an age, because I can point out things that are relevant to the person at the time of their life at that time. But that's it. That's all I need. So I hope you found this interesting. Let me know your thoughts. I'm curious to know what people think. I've not watched the Dispatches episode, the whole thing that's been made on him. I do find it a bit curious how, it's all kind of cropped up at the moment, and he's been really attacking big tech, big business, big pharma, big media, and it's all kind of come about now, whereas, Dispatches, normally they do shows on things that are quite sort of hard hitting subject matters that are, like the environment, or, some legislation, or some sort of scandal that's got a bigger story at the heart of it, whereas this is just one person. It just seems a bit odd and a bit coincidental, but at the same time, like I say, it's not to say that I don't believe that what he's being accused of is impossible. Okay, so there we go. Hope you've enjoyed this, and let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you on the next one. Also, let me know who you want me to read for next week as well. So I hope you've enjoyed. See you soon.